and we can get into it whenever you're ready, Jeff.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Well, thank you for having me here today. It would be nice to be up there in Brisbane, but that's not terribly easy just at the moment. So what I'm going to do is to talk. The talk today is one that I originally gave in honor of Bob Mugarar, who died a couple of years ago and who was a really influential presence in, I guess, the place studies area. He was also a very influential supervisor of many, many students at the University of Washington. And Bob's done some really groundbreaking work since the 70s right up until relatively recently. And one of the books that I've been most interested in that Bob did was his 2008 volume, Heidegger and Homecoming. And it's one of several books in which Bob explored Heidegger's thinking. But what's particularly interesting about that book for my purpose today is that it takes up issues of belonging and home that are central to the later Heidegger, terms that in my sense are topological in character and that are tied to notions of place and being in place that are significant in Heidegger, but also well beyond Heidegger. Now, these ideas, the ideas that Bob focuses on, belonging, home, place, or being in place, which are going to be the three terms that I focus on today, are central to Bob's work. They're also central to mine. And those ideas have been the subject of a great deal of attention over the last probably 50 years or so from many different quarters and across many different disciplines. That attention has frequently been extremely critical, however, so critical that it now seems to be assumed in some quarters that these ideas are so irretrievably problematic such that they cannot have any place in contemporary discourse. And the sort of criticism at issue here is sometimes directed more at one of these notions than another, belonging home, for instance, rather than place as such. But since all of these ideas are closely interconnected, and since both notions of belonging and home are tied to the idea of place and being in place, any criticism of one invariably tends to involve all of them, even if only implicitly. And so when the geographer John Wiley, for example, insists that, quote, a landscape cannot be a homeland, end of quote, he's not only refusing a certain way of understanding landscape, but his critique encompasses the understanding of place as well. Now, my discussion today is going to have three parts. First, I want to provide a brief survey of the main lines of argument that are typically directed at the notions at issue here. Second, I want to begin a bit of an exploration of the reasons why these ideas remain necessary, even in the face of their critique. And thirdly, I want to engage in a bit of a discussion of the task of retrieval of these ideas. Now, much of the critique of belonging and home comes to devolve, whether implicitly or not, onto the critique of place. Belonging and home typically being understood as notions that presuppose a certain relation to place as the basis for identity. Put simply, when who we are is taken to be determined by where we are, to where we belong, then such place attachment or place relatedness, both of these terms being common in the literature, is taken to give rise to various problematic consequences. And there are three main lines of critique and three problematic such consequences that are explored in the literature. The first, which is foremost in many accounts, is the idea that place is tied to exclusion. If identity is tied to place, so the argument goes, then the affirmation and preservation of identity requires exclusion of others from that place. The second is the idea that place is tied to a problematic form of determinism. If identity is tied to place, then this makes identity dependent on that which is bounded and so already determined, on that which cannot be changed, and to the determination by which one can only submit. For some writers, Emmanuel Levinas being one, this is especially problematic inasmuch as it supposedly makes the human subservient to place. And the third is the idea that the connection of identity to place involves an essential nostalgia. If identity is tied to place, then this ties identity to a certain mode of temporal orientation, specifically to an orientation that privileges the past and refuses to engage with the future. And of course, notice that these three lines of critique focus on this issue of identity, and that idea of identity has been central to many of these discussions of place, belonging, and home that I'm interested in here. What's centrally at issue throughout the general form of critique, and it's evident across many different writers, is the character of place as tied to a notion of boundary or boundedness, whether the boundedness of oneself by place, the boundedness of the other, or the boundedness of the past as against the supposed openness of the future. Such boundedness is understood as essentially exclusory in itself and restrictive, and as giving rise to politically regressive and xenophobic forms of thought and action. And so one of the claims I make is that the critical engagement with place is identical with the critical engagement with the notion of boundary. Now, boundary, or bound as it appears here, is more or less the same as the notion of horizontal limit. In fact, there's a very close connection between that notion of boundary and the phenomenological notion of horizon. And it's etymologically as well as semantically distinct from those other senses of bound associated with ideas of being tied to or being tied by, of springing forth or heading towards. The idea of bound or boundary is not, it should be noted, an additional notion over and above the idea of place, but is intimately connected to it, at least so long as we do indeed treat place as a sui generis concept with an irreducible content of its own. And that's sometimes an assumption or an idea that's challenged, or at least when it is challenged, it's done so implicitly. The ideas of topos and kora, which are the Greek precursors to the contemporary idea of place, and which we find in both Aristotle's Physics and in Plato's Timaeus, combine two notions, that of dimensionality and boundedness, so that the former arises on the basis of the latter, so that dimensionality arises on the basis of boundedness. The boundary, in other words, is that which gives room to that which appears within it. And this idea of place is not only evident in Plato and Aristotle, but it's also evident in more recent thinkers, such as Georg Simmel and famously Martin Heidegger. And this is an idea particularly developed in his building dwelling thinking. And in fact, Heidegger's view on this point, on this conception of place and boundedness, is itself, in my view, very much indebted to Simmel, even though Heidegger never makes that debt clear. Now, if we treat place as more or less interchangeable with space, as some people do, then place need not be understood as tied to boundedness simply because space isn't so tied, or at least not intrinsically. And it's commonplace for place to be understood in this way in contemporary discourse. And so place is often understood just as in terms of space or in terms of some demarcated region of space. And that means on that basis that place is, in those cases, almost always taken to be a modification of physical extension. When place is understood as identical with some spatial location or area, the demarcation of which is essentially contingent, then the boundedness of place also becomes contingent, just as place becomes contingent with it. And the possibility then arises of an emptied out notion of place that's no longer seen as problematic simply because it's no longer a notion that carries any special content of its own, and certainly needn't be seen as tied to boundedness, to exclusivity, determinacy, to the past, or indeed to belonging or home in any strong sense. And so a writer such as Doreen Massey, who's been especially influential within geographical circles, can argue for, in her words, a progressive sense of place. She distinguishes that very explicitly from regressive versions of the notion, which she identifies with Heidegger. Although it turns out that the notion of place at issue in Massey is a sense of place that's little more than the idea of a contingently delimited domain within a spatially extended field. And so, if you like, the progressivity of the notion really has very little to do with the concept as such. It's rather this idea that place is somehow retrieved or rescued by excising from it the contentful ideas of boundedness and so on. Now, the lines of argument at issue here regarding place as exclusionary, as determinate and determining, as nostalgic, are evident in the work of many different writers and thinkers. Perhaps most notably in the work of Levinas, but also in Theodor Adorno. Both Levinas and Adorno formulate their positions largely in reaction to Heidegger. In the work of Doreen Massey, as I mentioned before, as well as David Harvey, who's probably the other major figure on this topic in geography. In architectural theory, in the work of such as Hilde Heinen, David Leach, and Mark Wigley. And they're also elaborated across many disciplinary domains in ways that draw on a variety of theoretical frames, from critical theory to psychoanalysis, feminism to postmodernism, Marxism to liberalism. Such critiques of these notions, particularly of place, are now so common that in some fields they've become almost taken for granted. It's almost assumed that, of course, as soon as you mention place, if it has any distinctive content, you're mentioning an idea that is somehow committed to some sort of regressive and conservative politics. Now, there is another line of argument that also appears in some of the discussions of these notions, namely that such ideas are at odds with the character of the globalized, dynamic, and interconnected contemporary world. In other words, the idea is that these notions are not only fixated on the past in a problematic fashion, but they belong to the past. Now, I'll come back to this later on, since what's at issue here is directly tied up with the convergence between certain key elements in the critique of place and the increasingly spatialized modes of ordering that I would argue are characteristic of the contemporary world, and which, so I would claim, are directly connected with contemporary globalized technological capital. But more on that later. Now, there's no doubt that the language of home and of belonging and place have indeed often been deployed in ways tied up with problematic, exclusionary, and even oppressive and violent forms of thought and action. One only needs to look to the rhetoric of many contemporary right-wing politicians, but also the more generalized rhetoric around Brexit in the UK, for instance, or the alt-right in the US, to see how ideas of home can enter into reactionary politics. The startling way the language of homeland became part of the political vocabulary of governments across much of the English-speaking world after 9/11 also reinforces the sense in which home can readily be associated with xenophobic insecurities and repressive forms of governmental control. Yet the mere fact that the language of home, belonging, and place can indeed function in this way, although it may tell us a great deal about prevailing political and cultural climates, and it does have a direct impact on the ways in which language is used, this fact tells us very little about the terms or notions that are themselves in play here, and that there may be a disjunction between the way terms and ideas are deployed and what is really at issue in those terms and ideas is itself part of the ground for the possibility of critique. Moreover, a too narrow focus on particular ideas or uses of home, belonging, and place, especially in a contemporary context, can readily obscure the ubiquitous nature of these ideas. Notions of home and belonging are no more the exclusive preserve of conservatives than the notions of freedom and justice are the exclusive preserve of progressives. Such ideas have been drawn upon and continue to be drawn upon by groups and individuals from across the political spectrum. Even in pre-Second World War Germany, often taken to be exemplary of a political milieu in which home, belonging, and place have a central and problematic role, one can find these notions being drawn upon by both conservative and progressive figures over time, and even at one and the same time. And this is particularly notable, for instance, in the case of Wilhelmine Germany, as well as the Germany of the interwar years. The contemporary situation is a little different. Moreover, is little different from this. Moreover, across this breadth of uses, one can find examples of these notions being used in relation to both forms of exclusion and forms of inclusion as well. The ubiquity of the language of belonging, place, and home is itself something worthy of attention, since it reflects how entangled these terms are with everyday language. That they are so entangled is a direct reflection of their centrality. And so in this respect, belonging, place, and home are no different from other key notions like justice, truth, or the good that figure prominently in social and political discourse as well as elsewhere in ways that spread across the entirety of the political spectrum. It's because notions of home, belonging, and place are so central that they are also so frequently appealed to in a range of political contexts. And that they are central in this way is a direct consequence of the necessarily placed character of life and existence. And so this brings me to the second part of this talk, the centrality or even necessity of place, and so too of notions of belonging and home. Rather than these being notions that we can simply pick up or put down as if they were like tools lying around, the notions at issue arise out of our existing being in the world and are reflective of the character of that being. In other words, they constitute already extant phenomena rather than merely being elements in or artifacts of certain ways of talking and thinking. Part of what comes into view here is a point about the very nature of philosophical reflection and the way a certain sort of retrieval, as I'm calling it, might be part of such reflection. And that's the point I'll come back to as well. But for the moment, what I want to do is briefly explore the way ideas of place, belonging, and home are connected with other key concepts, of which perhaps the most salient is that of the self. Now, if we treat the latter term, the self, in a purely formal sense, and without yet offering any substantive notion of what it might be, then the self is that which is referred to in the first instance by the first person pronoun I, and which is also, therefore, a certain locus of agency and perception, and ultimately of deliberation and judgment, that also figures to varying degrees in such action, perception, deliberation, and judgment. No matter how much we might claim to be able to deconstruct the self, the fact remains that the self is necessarily implicated at the most basic level in the structure of action and perception. Without a capacity to distinguish self from environmental context, including from other agents, there can be no possibility of directed action or even of any integrated perceptual engagement with things, or indeed of deliberation and judgment. In phenomenological terms, the self is part of the necessary structure of intentionality. And similarly, in terms of empirical cognitive science, the self is a necessary part of the structure that makes cognition itself possible. Now, the ideas of home and of belonging are both directly connected to the idea of the self. They are terms that relate to the way in which the self is articulated in the world. This is especially the case if one understands the self not in terms of some underlying substance, but rather as a nexus of action and reflection that is both internally and externally articulated, a complex and dynamic unity of attitudes and dispositions, as well as comportments and behaviors. The self is, by its very nature, even when understood purely formally, a mode of differentiated existence. As such, the self is constituted through both its connectedness to the world and by its differentiation from the world and from others. Home and belonging both refer to this structure of identity, connection, and differentiation. There are as many different forms of home and belonging as there are different modes of articulation of the self. Modes of articulation that vary according to environmental context, historical background, social and cultural situatedness. The latter give rise to the contingencies of the self, but that there is a self and that it has a certain structure that is realized in and through those contingencies is not contingent, but necessary. As soon as one grasps the idea of the self as extended into the world, or to use the language of contemporary 4E cognition, as embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended, then one must recognize the self as necessarily emplaced also. And 4E cognition is actually underpinned, I would argue, by a fifth E, though it's one that's fundamental to all the others, emplacement. This is not a point that applies only to the self, of course, but also to the other concepts that tend to get employed here: mind, consciousness, mental content, even agency and sentience in general. Moreover, this idea of the emplaced character of the self and of existence that's articulated in contemporary cognitive science, as well, I might add, in various forms of what used to be called externalism, can be argued to already have been adumbrated in older work, in ethology, in psychology, and especially phenomenology. And so Heidegger's Sein und Zeit from 1927 already sets out a form of externalism, or what I would call topologism, in its idea of Dasein as being in the world, which even in 1927, Heidegger was connecting to the idea that has come into English as dwelling in his German wohnen or sich aufhalten, and that also has connotations of home and belonging, especially through notions of familiarity and habituation. Although it's worth noting that also in 1927, Heidegger's account of being in place doesn't exclude the potential uncanniness or unhomeliness of that being in place, of that being at home. It's this idea of self and existence as necessarily emplaced that's developed in more detail in Heidegger's later work, where place in itself becomes a much more central and explicit concept. And it's also developed in a series of in the work of a series of phenomenologically oriented thinkers over the last century. We could include in particular writers like Bachelard there. And the centrality of place here and of associated notions of home and belonging, as well as of embodiment, can be seen to reflect the inescapable character of existence as always an existence in the world, but as such, as also worked out in terms of specific places and spaces through specific forms of home and belonging, and at the same time as differentiated from the world itself. Existence is just this emplacing and belonging, understood as also a differentiating. Now, as it's fundamentally active, and this is that the emphasis on activity is a theme that runs through almost all of the thinkers and approaches, including both the phenomenological and the cognitive scientific. So the character of the being in place at issue here is itself always open, always dynamic, always negotiatory, and cannot be understood in terms of any simple deterministic structure. Moreover, the being in place at issue is almost always understood as indeed tied to boundedness, or more generally, this is much more explicit in the phenomenological literature, to finitude. Indeed, one of the great insights of many of the most important currents of philosophical thinking in the 20th century, although it has its roots in the 18th and 19th, particularly in Kant, is the idea, especially evident, I would say, in hermeneutic thinking, that it is precisely boundedness, which is also to say being in place, that makes possible cognition, knowledge, existence, rather than being merely restrictive of these. Such finitude is tied to facticity, to the always already character of existence, and it's this that underlies the stereotypical characterization of place-oriented thinking as nostalgic or backward-looking. But the recognition of facticity is just the recognition of the historicality of existence, and so of the necessary historicality even of the future, as well as of the character of existence as always something given to one, rather than being that which one simply creates or over which one can exercise mastery. It also involves a recognition of the inevitable character of existence as permeated by the experience of fragility and loss. And it's this that is the ground for the very real nostalgia, the melancholia that belongs with the experience of being in place, of being in the world, of belonging to the world, even of being often strangely at home. And so the charge of nostalgia, particularly when that's seen as being somehow backed up by the emphasis on facticity, gets this round the wrong way. It misunderstands the nature of facticity and misunderstands the way in which the nostalgia at work here is indeed a form of melancholia, a form of very deep-seated and ubiquitous melancholia. To be emplaced is to be given over to a world in which one belongs, but which one does not belong to, but which does not belong to one. A world to which one is subject, but which is not subject to you. A world that always exceeds any experience or articulation of it. And such ideas are powerfully evident in indigenous traditions, of course, around the world, but they're also present in modern thought and culture in many different forms, forms which often seem absent from the formations of contemporary political and economic life, or at least from the rhetoric that is associated with them. Already near the beginning of Western thinking, Aristotle reiterates what he takes to be a common claim, to the effect that to be is to be in place. And this idea captures the positive and productive sense of place and being in place that emerges so strongly in much of the thinking over the last century. It's this positive and productive sense that also underpins what's at issue in the fundamental notions of home and belonging. That role is one which can be clearly discerned in the analysis of cognition, of action and perception, and especially of mental content and memory in relation to knowledge and in relation, as I've already said, to the self. Now, I don't have time here to provide a fully worked out argument for the necessity of place. I've tried to do that in other works. And neither have I time, and nor am I going to try and show how the sort of fundamental account of being in place, belonging, and home that is at issue here would play out in terms of a more concrete analysis or more concrete analyses that may be undertaken from the perspective of specific disciplinary inquiries, though I think one could do that. My aim is rather the more limited one, showing why it might be that ideas of belonging, home, and place cannot be abandoned, even though these may often be misused, and the way these ideas can be seen to be grounded in both phenomenological and certain aspects of analytic thought, particularly within cognitive science, and so also, of course, in the empirical investigations that cognitive sciences and many of the other associated sciences undertake. And I would argue that these notions of belonging, home, and place have also come to be extremely important in many other disciplines, including sociology and history, as well as psychology, areas in which, as it were, the idea of any investigation of the human that prescinds from the situated or placed character of human being must be fundamentally mistaken. Similarly, of course, the knowledge of indigenous societies and their experiences in the face of colonialism also draws attention to the intimacy of the relation between identity, life, and existence, and the places in and through which identity, life, and existence are formed and shaped. Something articulated, of course, in Australian Indigenous thinking in many different ways. Thus, a claim like John Wiley's that, quote, a landscape cannot be a homeland, seems to me a much harder claim to make in country to an Indigenous audience than it can be made in a university lecture hall in a place like Brussels, London, or any other such city. The idea that there is not that embeddedness seems much easier to make in that sort of rather abstracted situation. Belonging, home, and place name contemporary problems, not because these notions retain an illegitimate currency, but rather because of the problematic relation to place that's emerged as a key feature of the contemporary world. The homelessness and displacement that is now such a common feature of societies around the world, which is evident in refugee camps and border zones in places like Gaza, as well as the Ukraine, is present on the streets too of almost every major city, and is a continuation of colonialism and racism, a result of war and political disruption, as well as being one of the products of globalized capital. And it's indeed a problem precisely because it concerns a lack of home and a disruption in place. And this is not merely about a lack of physical shelter, but as might be expected, given what I've said so far, about the absence of the conditions that enable the flourishing of life and existence, and that also enable the sense of identity and of belonging that contributes to a sense of community, even of a pluralistic community. Part of the problem, of course, is the way in which the very possibility for the articulation of the self in the world is undermined by the problematization of place, of belonging, and home. Rather than the ideas of belonging, home, and place being antagonistic to plurality and difference, they provide their necessary preconditions. Indeed, the idea of pluralistic community cannot be the idea of a community that effaces home or belonging, but rather one that gives home to a plurality of different homes and forms of belonging. In fact, plurality presupposes difference, but difference is precisely what is articulated through the different modes of being in the world that are worked out only in and through different places, different homes, different identities, and different belongings. The problem is not the existence of difference, nor of difference as worked out in place, nor is the problem one of the boundedness that is a necessary part of that difference in the working out. Rather, the problem is the refusal of boundedness and the denial of the mutuality that itself belongs to differentiation. Far from being exclusionary, place, and so the boundary with it, opens up the possibility of inclusivity, of plurality, of difference, which is always an exclusivity, a plurality, a difference that appears in and with respect to concrete places, in and with respect to our own place, and so our own relatedness to the world. If the boundary, like place, is productive in the sense I suggested earlier, then that productiveness applies both to what is within and what is without the boundary. The boundary is that which establishes the possibility both of differentiation, but also of communication across difference, which is why the border, the bounding path or limes, hence the liminal, is such an important place. And so too, we have to understand the way in which every boundary connects at the same time as it disconnects, a point that is emphasized in Georg Simmel's work. This idea is reflected in the character of places as themselves always entangled with other places, both within the place and without. To be in place is not merely to be stuck within a single enclosed space. To use an example Walter Benjamin uses, as if one were enclosed within a hard shell, but rather to be embedded within a complex of places. Every place opens out to other places, just as the boundary of the horizon beckons one towards other places that lie beyond it. And every place opens up to other places within it. Even the most familiar place is thus capable of revealing new discoveries, something that Bachelard makes very, very clear in the Poetics of Space. Far from being determined and determining, then, the place and so also the boundary is what opens up to the indeterminate at the same time as it allows a certain limited determinacy that occurs in the very placing of things here in this place. It's because of the necessity of place that the retrieval of place, which I understand to be a matter of the rethinking and recollection of place in the face of its forgetting or refusal, is such an important task. Even the attempt to assert the need for the abandonment of place, which is common amongst so many recent writers, takes place from within its own place and on the basis of an existing orientation to the world and to thinking. The abandonment of place is itself a placed attempt. All thinking, all critique begins somewhere. The question is not whether it can escape its beginning, but whether it attends to it, and whether it attends to the boundaries that make such critique, or the articulation of critique, possible. One of the problems with much of the recent and contemporary critique of place, including in the work of people like Wiley, but also extending to the work of others such as Massey, Harvey, and a host of other writers, one of the problems is the refusal of such critique to attend to its own place, which means to attend to its own boundaries and presuppositions, its own ground. As a result, such critique often operates through the repetition of standard tropes and assumptions, perhaps not surprising, often repeating those which originally appeared in Adorno or Levinas, like those regarding the character of place as invariably given over to exclusion, to determination, to the problematically nostalgic, all of which are criticisms that appear in the 1940s, or certainly in the 1950s, in the work of Adorno, and to some extent Levinas too. And few of these critiques pay any attention to the more complex aspects of place and belonging that I tried to set out earlier when I was discussing the necessity of place. Now, one of the reasons for this, I think, is tied up with the discursive insularity and internalization of much contemporary critical discourse. So much discussion remains within the circles of engagement established by familiar texts and theoretical positions. Critique thus becomes a purely textual practice rather than a genuinely reflective engagement with the issues. But associated with this is a tendency for that insularity and internalization also to be reflected in a tendency to operate with respect to already assumed ideological or polemical positions. And so the critical engagement with an issue or idea becomes simply expressive of a certain politics, rather than showing how, for instance, a certain political response might emerge as a consequence of what is at stake and is appropriate to it. And I think this is actually very true of Adorno and Levinas, particularly of Adorno. Directly connected with this is a tendency to refuse consideration of what might be termed the ontological in favor of a focus on the affective and discursive. Suspicion of ontology has a long history in the social sciences, especially, which is where much of the recent discussion of place has centered, where the ontological, usually identified with the metaphysical, is contrasted with the empirical, the variable, and the contingent. Sometimes the eschewing of ontology is defended by a sort of Rawlsian argument concerning the plurality of conceptions of the good. But in fact, most contemporary critique, especially in as much as it aligns itself with a broadly progressivist agenda, is not at all agnostic in this way, but holds to very clear conceptions of the good, even if not always made explicit. Moreover, when it comes to the critique of notions like belonging, place, and home, there seems little reticence in asserting the problematic ethical and political content that's supposedly intrinsic to these notions, a claim that is itself implicitly ontological in character, since it's a claim about those notions as such, about their fundamental character and ground, rather than merely concerning particular instances of their deployment. If critical engagement is to be more than mere polemic, it's to be found a part of a genuine attempt at thinking, then it has to involve reflection both on the phenomenon at issue and the framework of the thinking from within which that phenomenon is approached. Now, this is a familiar hermeneutic point. To paraphrase Gadamer, all critique is a form of self-critique, and all critique must take the form of a dialogue in which something is at stake, and in which what is at stake must be given space to appear in its own terms. There is an ethical imperative to critique that emerges here that follows from the way critique is embedded in its place. And I would argue that ethics is itself only properly understood when it's understood as also tied to place. So that's something I have to leave to one side. To attend to what is at stake is also to attend to the character of the phenomenon, and so to enter into what is ultimately a form of ontological inquiry. And that, of course, is a large part of what I was talking about when I was talking about the importance of place in relation to identity and the self earlier. My focus was on the character of place and of the self, on what they are, rather than merely what is said about them. The task of retrieval, understood as having this essentially ontological character, because of the need for that task to attend to the ground from which it can emerge, is not some esoteric practice predicated on a special kind of access to an otherwise hidden essence to things. It is rather a matter of rethinking what we already think we know in a way that attends to what is actually at issue and to the phenomena that draw our attention in the first place. And such retrieval is especially important when the phenomena in question are indeed as central to life and existence as the issues or the topics at stake here. Now, the topological ideas that have been at work in this discussion over the last 30 to 40 minutes are central to critical inquiry, as to any form of inquiry, because they're themselves part of the structure of thought as it belongs to the structure of being in the world. Again, this is an ontological claim, but I think it's one that's eminently defensible and cannot be dismissed simply by any blanket dismissal of the ontological in general. But these ideas also have a clear role to play in terms of the attempt to engage critically with our contemporary situation, our contemporary place. And it isn't just the loss of home that's so evident in the contemporary world that makes these notions significant. The history of modernity as a worldwide phenomenon is a history that's itself closely tied up with topological and spatial structures and developments. One might even say that modernity has its origins in the separating out of place from space. This separating out has taken various forms. It appears in the history of ideas, a history well elaborated in Ed Casey's work, in terms of the development of a notion of physical space that is not dependent on any prior notion of boundedness, but is instead tied to the idea of homogeneous isotropic extensionality or dimensionality, and of place is entirely secondary to this, being merely the idea of a location or area within such an extended domain. This spatialized way of understanding is tied to the quantitative and numerical, and it's evident in the character of contemporary science as predicated on quantitative and numerical analysis, those disciplines that resist such quantification running the risk of appearing irrelevant or unscientific. In the character of modern organizations as subject to purely managerialist modes of operation that are themselves centered around quantitative, numerical, and increasingly automated systems. It's evident too in the transformation of social relations through systems of personalized electronic communication and exchange based around the computer and mobile phone, and including media platforms such as X and Facebook, and through the structure of globalized corporate or oligopoly capitalism that is itself intimately entangled with the quantitative and numerical, with the managerial, with the technological, at the same time as it also reinforces and draws all of these together. Now, if we refer to this spatialized mode of world formation, and I realize I'm making some very sweeping claims here without having the time to back them up, but I have done so elsewhere. If we refer to this spatialized mode of world formation, in which everything is drawn within the same all-encompassing and ultimately reductive system as technology, which is one of the ways Heidegger refers to it, then we may perhaps recognize it as essentially the same phenomenon that is often at work in the progressivism that we've inherited from the Enlightenment that seeks to free human being from any sense of being limited by its situation, whether historical, geographic, or ontological. The escape from place that seems to me to be at issue here is precisely, though now in a twofold sense, the escape into the unboundedness of space. But this escape is an escape into the purely quantitative, the numerical, the manageable, the monetizable. The philosophical embodiment of this idea of escape is essentially that given in Cartesianism and its many offshoots, since what characterizes Cartesian thinking is precisely the privileging of space over place. But among many of the contemporary critics of place, one finds a similar privileging of space that replicates the structures at the heart of contemporary managerialist, technological, globalized capitalism. Structures of unbounded connectivity, of what Heidegger refers to as an unbounded inframing or positioning. And this is true, ironically enough, even of those writers like Harvey and to some extent Massey, for whom the critique of capitalism has been so central. It's the rejection of any sui generis idea of place that facilitates the critique of place that is evident in the work of such thinkers. But that rejection, the rejection of a sui generis idea of place, is fundamental also to the possibility of modernity as it's manifest in both intellectual terms and in terms of the socio-economic and the political. And in this respect, perhaps not surprisingly, Harvey and Massey remain firmly within a very, very modernist frame, a spatialized frame. And I would add that so too does Levinas. In fact, Levinas is a particularly interesting case here because much of Levinas's critique of place directed at Heidegger is predicated on the assumption of what is essentially a fundamentally Cartesian view of space. Now, the underlying problem with the spatialized mode of world formation that's evident here is that despite its seeming effacement of place, it remains ontologically founded, no matter its claims to the contrary, in the same topology that I sketched out earlier. The Aristotelian dictum that to be is to be placed remains no less true in 2021 or 2024 than it was in 350 BC. Consequently, the spatialized mode of engagement that characterizes contemporary thought and practice is in direct tension with the topological, that is, the placed structure on which it depends, a topological structure, nevertheless, that it both obscures and forgets. It's the retrieval of that structure and the task of remembering and recollecting it that is the real challenge for contemporary critique. And that task of remembering and recollection isn't simply a matter of somehow returning to our nostalgically conceived past in the problematic sense of nostalgia. It's not simply a matter of trying to re-establish the past, but rather of trying to reappropriate at the same time as we understand that which we come from in relation to that which we move towards. It's this task that, as Bob Mugarow describes it, does indeed involve a form of homecoming. It's a very different form of homecoming from that which is usually recognized in the literature. Fundamentally, it's a matter of coming back to a place that we never really left, but a place that has become obscure, a place that has been forgotten, a place that in many instances we seem to have wanted to refuse. But such refusal is always going to be a refusal that creates problems for us because it's a refusal essentially of our own selves, of our own place. Now, I know there's a heck of a lot of stuff in there, and as I go through it, I realize just how dense it is and how much it depends on so much other work that I've done over the last 30 or 40 years. But hopefully that at least means that there should be plenty of questions from everybody because nobody will really have followed all of the argument. So I'm hoping there will be plenty of questions and things can become clear in question time. And so I'll hand things back to Michael.
Thanks very much for that, Jeff. Why don't we take a 5-minute break just for people to compose their questions and stretch their legs if they need to. And then we could get into that.